Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in the high stakes trade war with China, the US didn't just fail to win, it decisively lost? And what if I told you the real damage wasn't just about tariffs or soybeans, but was a strategic catastrophe that will weaken America's position for a generation to come? So, let's start by looking at the summit itself. On the surface, it was presented as a truce, but as we'll see, this was really just a superficial win for Trump. The high stakes summit between President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping, held in South Korea during the AP East Forum, was a moment of intense global scrutiny. China's leader, Xi Jinping, offered a starkly different performance. His public remarks were the epitome of measured strategic diplomacy. There was no boasting, no superlatives. Instead, he acknowledged the realities of the relationship, noting that it is natural for the world's two largest economies to have frictions. This language, while seemingly mundane, was a deliberate counter-programming to Trump's high-octane rhetoric. It framed the conflict not as a personal dispute to be won or lost in a single encounter, but as an ongoing complex interaction between two great powers. More pointedly, his words carried a polite but unmistakable warning. He remarked that the recent twists and turns should be instructive to both sides, a thinly veiled suggestion that the lessons were primarily for Washington to learn. He urged President Trump to focus on long-term cooperation and to avoid falling into a vicious cycle of mutual retaliation. This was the language of the victor, a calm admonishment to the vanquished, delivered with the serene confidence of a leader who knew he held the stronger hand. He was not there to celebrate a truce. He was there to dictate the terms of a temporary pause in a conflict he believed he was winning. He was in effect teaching Trump that impulsive actions have severe and predictable consequences. This disconnect between the two narratives was not lost on analysts and critics. The consensus that quickly formed was that the deal was in fact not a deal at all. It was, as many described it, a modest truce, a ceasefire, or simply a pause in the economic hostilities. It was a temporary rollback of punitive measures, a mutual agreement to step back from the brink, but it was fundamentally not a resolution. The agreement was in essence an armistice, not a peace treaty. Both sides agreed to lower their weapons, but neither side agreed to surrender them. The very structure of the agreement, with its short-term time horizons, pointed to its fragility. The superficiality of the truce was most evident in what it failed to address. The core long-standing economic frictions that ostensibly started the trade war were left completely untouched. There was no new framework to address China's extensive use of state subsidies to prop up its domestic industries, a practice the US has long argued creates an unlevel playing field. There was no progress on securing greater market access for foreign companies, which still face significant barriers to entry and operation within China. And there was no mention of the persistent issue of cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, a foundational complaint of US businesses. The truce was a negotiation about tariffs, not about the fundamental structure of the US-China economic relationship. It was a tactical retreat, not a strategic victory, and it left all the most difficult problems for another day, a day that might never come. Now, what was actually in this 1 year agreement? When you examine the specific terms, it quickly becomes clear this was a rollback, not a true reset. Examining the specific terms of the agreement reveals the true nature of this truce. It was not a comprehensive reset of trade relations, but a transactional tit-for-tat rollback of the most recent escalations. The agreement was less a grand bargain and more a list of mutual concessions designed to alleviate short-term political and economic pain on both sides. The 1 year timeline attached to its most critical components underscored its identity as a temporary fix, a can kick down the road rather than a bridge built. The concessions made by the United States were significant and immediate. First and most publicly, the Trump administration agreed to reduce the overall tariff rate on Chinese imports from a punishing 57% down to 47%. This 10% reduction, while not a full repeal, was a major concession that provided immediate relief to Chinese exporters and by extension to American consumers and businesses reliant on those imports. It was a clear admission that the tariff-heavy strategy had reached its ceiling and was inflicting unacceptable collateral damage. Second, and perhaps more strategically significant, the U.S. agreed to a 1 year suspension of restrictions on semiconductor sales to China. This was a direct reversal of a key pressure point in the burgeoning tech war. The U.S. also agreed for that same 1 year period not to add any more Chinese technology companies to its entities list, a blacklist that had effectively crippled companies like Huawei. This concession was a major relief for China's technology sector and a tacit acknowledgement from Washington that its aggressive restrictions were also harming American chip manufacturers who relied on the Chinese market for a massive portion of their revenue. Third, in a smaller but symbolic move, the U.S. agreed to reverse newly introduced charges on Chinese boats docking in American ports. Like the other concessions, this was a direct rollback of a recent punitive measure, wiping the slate clean and returning to the status quo that existed before the latest round of escalations. Taken together, these concessions represented a clear de-escalation from the American side, a tangible unwinding of the very policies Trump had championed as his primary leverage. China's concessions, in turn, were largely a mirror image of the American rollbacks. They were for the most part a simple agreement to stop their own retaliatory measures. First, in a direct quid pro quo for the 10% tariff cut, China pledged to take very strong action on the chemicals used to produce fentanyl. This included new measures to counter the money laundering associated with the illicit trade. This was a key win for President Trump, allowing him to return to Washington and claim he had extracted a major concession on a deadly domestic issue. Second, China agreed to pause its export controls on processed rare earth minerals and magnets for 1 year. This was arguably the most critical component of the entire agreement. China had recently weaponized its near total dominance of the rare earth supply chain, a move that sent shock waves through global defense, technology, and manufacturing industries. This 1 year pause was a powerful bargaining chip, and its inclusion in the deal signaled that China knew exactly where America's greatest vulnerability lay. Third, China agreed to resume purchasing American farm products with a specific focus on soybeans. This was a direct reversal of its own retaliatory tariffs, which had devastated Trump's political heartland in the American farming belt. Like the fentanyl promise, this allowed Trump to claim a direct victory for a key domestic constituency. Finally, the agreement established a framework to improve the sale of TikTok's U.S. operations to an American buyer, a nod to a lingering geopolitical flashpoint. Beyond these specific terms, the agreement was thin. It consisted mostly of promises for future engagement. Both leaders agreed to maintain regular communication. President Trump announced plans to visit China in April for follow up talks, and Xi Jinping would in turn visit the U.S. at a later date. These plans for future meetings were presented as progress, but in reality, they simply confirmed the temporary, unresolved nature of the truce. The deal was not a conclusion. It was merely an agreement to keep talking, having mutually agreed that the cost of the fight had become, for the moment, too high to bear. This brings me to the centerpiece of the entire negotiation, which is how China gained the upper hand. It really all comes down to one thing: the rare earths leverage. The centerpiece of this entire negotiation, and the clearest evidence of China's strategic victory, was the issue of rare earth minerals. More than any other single factor, China's leverage over these critical materials dictated the terms of the truce and exposed the fundamental weakness of the U.S. position. President Trump's attempt to spin this reality only highlighted the disparity. He triumphantly declared to the media that the roadblock is gone and that the entire rare earth situation was settled. This was a remarkable exercise in wishful thinking, a gross mischaracterization of the agreement. The reality was that nothing was settled. The agreement was not a cancellation of China's export controls. It was a pause. The deal explicitly stated that the suspension of these controls was for 1 year. This meant that the roadblock was not gone at all. It was merely lifted for a fixed period, a ticking clock that would require the U.S. to return to the negotiating table in a matter of months. To prevent its return, China retained its leverage and had successfully transformed its rare earths dominance from a passive economic fact into an active weaponized tool of statecraft that it could deploy or retract at will. The trade war, in a moment of supreme irony, have served as a painful education for the Trump administration. It demonstrated in the starkest possible terms that the United States needs China's rare earth minerals far more than China needs American soybean. While the soybean cutoff caused immense political and economic pain for a specific, if vocal, U.S. sector, a rare earths cutoff threatened to paralyze vast swaths of the American economy, including the defense industry, consumer electronics, and green technology sectors. China's power does not merely stem from mining these minerals. Its true monopoly and the source of its leverage is in the processing and refining for several key processed minerals and magnets. China controls close to 100% of the global supply. This is a dominance built over decades, a result of strategic industrial policy, high technical expertise, and a willingness to bear the significant environmental costs associated with the refining process. This near total monopoly means that even if the US or its allies were to mine their own raw ore, they would still be forced to send it to China for processing. This brings us to the most critical strategic blunder of the trade war. Before President Trump launched his unilateral tariff offensive, China was not actively weaponizing this monopoly. It was for the most part a reliable market-driven supplier. The trade war taught China to view this dominance as a weapon. By attacking China, Trump forced its leadership to identify and deploy its most powerful retaliatory tools. Now that this card has been played, the world has seen what it looks like and the threat of its redeployment now hangs over every future negotiation. The genie, as it were, cannot be put back in the bottle. The West's vulnerability in this area is profound and cannot be overstated. According to expert estimates, even if the West were to make it a top national priority, throwing massive investment into the project, it would still take a minimum of 7 years and likely more than a decade to build a comprehensive independent supply chain for rare earth processing. This is not a problem that can be solved in a single presidential term. A chilling historical precedent confirms this difficult timeline. In 2010, China briefly used rare earths as leverage against Japan in a territorial dispute. This event served as a massive wake-up call for Tokyo, which immediately resolved to reduce its dependency. In the 15 years since that incident, despite a concerted national effort, Japan has only managed to reduce its dependency on Chinese rare earths from 85% to 60%. This 15-year struggle to achieve only a partial reduction demonstrates the monumental scale of the challenge and confirms that China's leverage is not going away anytime soon. Understanding this context reveals the escalate to de-escalate strategy that China executed to perfection. When the Trump administration escalated the trade war, China responded not just by targeting soybeans, but by threatening crippling export controls on all critical minerals. It floated the idea of a foreign direct product rule equivalent, which would block the sale of any product from any company anywhere in the world if it used Chinese processed minerals. This threat effectively forced the US on its back foot. It was a move that threatened to shut down defense contractors and tech giants alike. Faced with this economic mutually assured destruction, it was Trump who was forced to de-escalate, coming to the summit not from a position of strength, but as a leader desperate to get a pause on a weapon he had no defense against. But the consequences of this go far beyond just a bilateral trade deal. We really need to talk about the broader geopolitical fallout and what it means for America's weakened position on the world stage. The consequences of President Trump's trade war extend far beyond the bilateral relationship with Beijing. The conflict has inflicted deep and lasting collateral damage on America's geopolitical standing, alienating allies, destroying credibility, and ultimately leaving the US in a weak, compromised position. By launching a unilateral America First tariff offensive, Trump did not just target China, he targeted the entire world, including the very allies the US needs to effectively counter China's rise. By imposing tariffs on allies in Southeast Asia, President Trump definitively pushed them all towards China. These nations, already walking a delicate tightrope between the two superpowers, were suddenly punished by their supposed security guarantor. This action made China's economic overtures through its Belt and Road Initiative and other regional partnerships appear far more stable and reliable than America's erratic and punitive policies. It was a massive self-inflicted strategic wound. This blunder was compounded by the administration's historical context. Early in his first term, President Trump had unilaterally aborted the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. The TPP was a massive 10-year diplomatic effort designed specifically to create a US-led economic bloc in Asia that would exclude China and set new high standards for trade, labor, and the environment. It was the primary economic tool for the pivot to Asia and the most potent lever of power the US had to counter Chinese influence. Trump's withdrawal from the TPP, a pact he called a disaster, created a massive power vacuum in the region. His subsequent decision to then attack these same regional partners with tariffs was seen as an act of profound strategic incoherence. The View from the region confirmed this assessment. The Prime Minister of Singapore, a key U.S. partner, stated publicly that the tariffs had certainly impacted America's standing in Southeast Asia and that the U.S. is no longer trusted in the region. This loss of trust is catastrophic. It has signaled to Asian nations that America is an unreliable partner prone to sudden irrational policy shifts that disregard their interests. As a result, these nations have been forced to hedge their bets and move closer to China, the very outcome U.S. foreign policy was designed to prevent. This strategic miscalculation was not lost on observers in Washington. The Center for American Progress, a U.S. think tank, delivered a scathing assessment, concluding that the Trump administration had willfully destroyed U.S. levers of power in advance of the summit with CY. The report argued that Trump entered the meeting in a weak, compromised position, having already alienated his allies and demonstrated his vulnerability on rare earths. The trade war, which was intended to show American strength, had only served to educate the Trump administration on its own weaknesses, while simultaneously increasing China's confidence in its ability to push its advantage. The weakness of the U.S. position was further highlighted by the critical issues that were conspicuously omitted from the summit's agenda. Most notably, the issue of Taiwan was, according to Trump himself, not discussed at all. While this was seen as a relief by Taipei, it was a significant strategic signal. It suggested that China, having established its economic leverage now, feels it can set the agenda. It is patient. It can afford to be its time on sensitive territorial issues, knowing it can reapply economic pressure in future negotiations to extract concessions in other spheres, including Taiwan. Similarly, while President Trump claimed they discussed the war in Ukraine and agreed to work together to end it, his ambiguous follow-up comment that sometimes you have to let them fight created deep uncertainty. It reinforced the view of Trump as a purely transactional leader, unmanned from any consistent alliance commitments, and further unsettled European allies who rely on American resolve. This sense of a strategic failure was echoed in the domestic criticism of the truce. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer immediately labeled the deal a total dud. He argued that the truce was only necessary because Trump had created a mess, and now he wants to take credit for pretending like he fixed it. This sentiment was particularly acute in the agricultural sector. The win for American farmers, the resumption of soybean sales, was not a new victory. It was merely a partial reversal of the catastrophic damage that Trump's own tariff frenzy had inflicted on them in the first place. They were not winning. They were simply being allowed to recover from self-inflicted wounds, all while being used as political pawns in a war they did not ask for. And this really deserves a closer look. This idea of strategic incoherence and how the damage to alliances went far beyond just hurt feelings. To truly understand why the U.S. entered that summit in such a compromised position, we have to talk about the original sin of Trump's trade policy, the day one withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This decision is without a doubt the single greatest strategic gift any American president has ever given Beijing. The TPP was never just a trade deal. It was a profound geopolitical strategy. It was a 10-year project designed by the United States to write the economic rules for the 21st century in the world's fastest growing region. It included high standards for labor, environmental protection, intellectual property, and data flows, all areas where China could not compete. And most importantly, it was a bloc that excluded China, creating a powerful economic counterweight that bound allies like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, and Canada to the American system. When Trump walked away, he didn't just scrap a pact. He surrendered America's economic leadership in Asia. He threw the keys to the kingdom on the table and walked out of the room. Nature abhors a vacuum. Into that massive void stepped Xi Jinping. While Trump was busy picking fights, China was quietly finalizing its own mega trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCE, where the TPP was complex and high standard. Erupt was simple. It was all about integrating supply chains, lowering tariffs, and placing China squarely at the center of the Asian Pacific economy. And who joined this China pact? Key U.S. allies, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, the very nations Trump was simultaneously alienating. They had no choice. Their economic futures depended on regional integration, and the U.S. had just announced it was no longer interested in leading. This set the stage for the disastrous sequence that followed. Trump didn't just abandon his allies by leaving the TPP. He then turned around and attacked them. He hit Japan and South Korea with steel tariffs. He threatened auto tariffs that would have crippled their economies. He berated Vietnam, a crucial partner in pushing back on Chinese expansionism, as a trade cheat. From the perspective of Tokyo, Seoul, or Hanoi, this was strategic madness. The U.S. was asking them to stand strong against Chinese aggression while simultaneously punching them in the face with economic sanctions. It was an impossible and incoherent demand. The result was predictable. These nations, as the Prime Minister of Singapore noted, were forced to multi-align. They diversified their strategic bets. They signed RC with China. They salvaged the TPP, rebranding it as the CPTP, and moved on without the United States. They learned the hard lesson that America, under this administration, was not a reliable partner. This is the critical context for the loss. When President Trump finally sat down with Xi Jinping, he had no coalition. He couldn't bring a united front of allies to the table to jointly pressure China on its subsidies, its market access barriers, or its intellectual property theft. He had systematically insulted and alienated every nation that shared those same concerns. He was, as the Center for American Progress correctly noted, in a strategic freefall, isolated, compromised, and alone. He had reduced a complex, multi-dead geopolitical chess match into a short-term transactional squabble over soybeans and tariffs. It was a game China was guaranteed to win, not just because it held the rare earths card, but because it never for 1 second lost sight of the larger strategic board. Trump was focused on the next news cycle. He was focused on the next decade. So where does all of this leave us? To conclude, it's important to understand the long-term consequences of this lost war. The summit in South Korea, for all its presidential pageantry, was not the triumphant conclusion of a trade war. It was the formal ratification of a strategic defeat. The final analysis is clear. China emerged from this conflict holding the real long-term leverage, while President Trump was forced to accept a temporary truce that allowed him to claim victory for a domestic audience. It was a deal born not of strength but of desperation. While some analysts, in an effort to appear balanced, may argue that there was no clear winner or loser, the evidence presented by the truce itself points to an undeniable Chinese advantage. The terms of the agreement are not those of a negotiation between equals. They are the terms of a dominant power granting a temporary reprieve to a challenger who has overplayed his hand. The United States conceded on tariffs, conceded on technology restrictions, and reversed its port fees. In exchange, China agreed to pause its most potent retaliatory measures, the rare earth blockade and the agricultural boycott, while simultaneously extracting a U.S. concession on fentanyl. Trump's win was not a substantive victory. It was simply the temporary relief from the domestic political pressure his own policies had created. He needed the pain to stop, and China dictated the price. This temporary truce does nothing to alter the fundamental dynamic of the US China relationship. The intense long-term competition over the technologies of the future, such as artificial intelligence, and the deeper struggle over the shape of the 21st century global order all remain unchanged. This agreement was a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. It leaves all the most complex and foundational issues of the relationship to fester now with an added layer of mistrust and proven vulnerability. The true lasting legacy of this trade war is not found in the percentage points of tariffs or the bushels of soybeans. The primary negative impact, the one that will long outlive this administration, is the weaponization of integrated global supply chains. For decades, the post-Cold War world was built on a consensus that economic interdependence was an engine for growth and a ballast for global peace. The Trump administration, through its unilateral actions, shattered that consensus. It taught the world, and most importantly, it taught China, that this interdependence is not a strength, but a profound vulnerability. We now must live in the massively degraded situation this trade war has created. It is a world where supply chains are no longer viewed as pathways to prosperity, but as potential weapons to be hoarded or severed. It is a world where trust has been broken, and every nation must now reassess its dependencies, looking for ways to de-risk or decouple from the global economy. This shift, more than any single tariff or political summit, will be the most disastrous and defining impact of this entire episode. Trump did not just start a trade war. He helped to break the system of global trade itself, leaving the world a more fragmented, less stable, and far more dangerous place.